Hey everybody, it's Tripl-L coming in to talk about My Hero Academia chapter 304. It's very late. I'm going to try and get through this really quick, but we got a lot to talk about. Don't know if I will talk about everything, but we got a lot to talk about. Anyway, hey, I hope you're all having a great day. This is going to be a fun one. This is an interesting chapter in that we didn't really do much, but we got some morsels of information that are really worthwhile. So before I get into that, I want to just very quickly say, if you read the fan translation, you definitely need to read the Viz translation, because this week there are weird things going on with translation. The best example I can give you so that you understand how bad this is the Viz translation saying, all this time we believe that the raw spirits of us predecessors resided within One for All. And then you have the fan translation was that we thought that a successor's consciousness manifesting itself in this realm was tied to their quirk. I'm not sure if you can see that, but those two panels are the same panels and they're completely different. It's the opposite thought. So keep that in mind. This week, the translations are 180 from each other, and it's really interesting to see that. Honestly, I would have had a lot more complaints to lob at this chapter if the fan translations were maintained in Viz, in all honesty. Anyway, just that's the first little bit here. Next, I want to talk about just a general note with what we get here. At the end of the chapter, the big message is Izuku is going to be the last owner of One for All, and also that One for All cannot be passed to other people. In case I go into the next little bit of the chapter and I start dissecting that opinion, I need to make it clear here that this is really good for the story. From the perspective of the story, and from our perspective, we want everything in this chapter to be true, even though there's actually a lot of questionable things happening here. The reason we want this to be true is because it simplifies the situation a little bit, and also it takes away some agency from Izuku so that Izuku has less opportunities to screw everything up. And what I mean by that is, this chapter invokes Nadai, and with good reason. It's because Izuku cannot be trusted to believe in himself. Izuku's self-esteem is shot. Izuku, if he feels like he is inferior, which we know he does, he's going to give away the quirk. That's why it's really important that the author take that away from him, because Izuku cannot be trusted to say, no, I'm not going to give you my quirk. I believe I deserve it. No, Izuku's too meek for that. That's why you need the story to give him a reason, being like, oh man, I can't give you the quirk because it's going to kill you, right? If he can move it so that Izuku doesn't have to actually have balls in the situation, he's going to do it, and that's exactly what we have here. We cannot go into another situation where Izuku is being persuaded into giving up his quirk and he feels bad and he feels like someone else would do a better job with it. No, Izuku has to start liking himself. The author has essentially said that Izuku's not going to do that, so that's why the author takes away that autonomy. Izuku's decision is made for him, and this simplifies a lot of the process. People were concerned that maybe Hawks would have Izuku give the quirk up to someone else. Well, no. Now that concern has been answered by otherworldly forces, and that should be appreciated. And also, I'm being a little bit cynical here just for like the extra humor. Taking away some of the edge there. Yeah, no, it's still good for the story, and legitimately, Izuku has bad self-confidence. This is better. From a critical point of view, as a reader, you have to acknowledge that this is a crutch. The most cynical interpretation here would be wondering if Horikoshi believes that he would have to depict Izuku as being a kind of character that would give up the quirk. If he's still stuck on that mentality, then that's not very good for Izuku, but it's hard to say what exactly he's going for here, or what was going on in the back of his mind. Now, that's one thing talking about the author and Izuku. Ultimately, before we move on, I want to say it again. This is really good for the story and would be great if this is what's maintained for the rest of the story. But before we move on into the page-by-page walkthrough, it is worth talking about the wonderful author and the things that he does, because this is actually having to do with the writing. So this is a very interesting chapter, and I want to take you back to chapter 257. Now, this is the panel that I really want to talk to you about, because this is an example of All Might being an unreliable narrator. And the reason I bring this up is just so that I can remind you, the readers, of the tactics that the author uses to make his story work. This is just storytelling technique here, but it's important to understand the distinction between plot holes and unreliable narrators, or just what exactly makes it so a character shouldn't be relied upon. All Might is one of the most unreliable people in the series. We know this. He is a horrible communicator in story, and for the purposes of the narrative, All Might has been used to draw the reader into a false sense of security. In this panel, we have a wonderful time where All Might was telling Izuku, hey, Izuku, those guys, they weren't really chosen ones. Through all those battles, all they could do was receive the quirk and entrust it to the other. Now, when you look at this chapter, and you look at what Hikage, the fourth user, did, you can kind of tell that this rhetoric doesn't apply fully. And this is the big thing. Why did All Might say this line in the past? Well, that's just because it's more of the same. All Might doesn't know everything. It's more of the same. They weren't really chosen ones. No. He was covering those guys. There is enough reason in this chapter to believe that that is different. The reason being, Hikage had that thing for 18 years. He realized what was going on in his last year of life, and Banjo, from the way that Banjo interacts with Hikage, and I'll point it out in the chapter, Banjo seems to have had a good relationship with him, enough that he can jab at him while they're both dead. No. You want to tell me that they weren't really chosen ones? It seems to me like Hikage got to apply the regular chosen one thing. He got to train that quirk, and when he knew his time was up, he had a year to go look for Banjo. Or maybe he knew Banjo. Maybe that actually was a good passing. Now, mind you, All Might's situation here makes sense because he's trying to say that, like these guys didn't have the quirk for long. I mean, he is kind of trying to take away the value from these people, but we can now see Banjo most definitely was a chosen one. You don't get to not be a chosen one when their predecessor has been holding the quirk for 18 years. That panel, in terms of what it did for the narrative, it kind of made Izuku and All Might's placement and everything more important, and I think that might have been the purpose of it back then, but now we know. Also, with the second and third user, the fourth user made an interesting comment in the chapter that he knew he wasn't going to be able to handle all for one once he received the quirk. So that really does seem to me like the third user was able to give the fourth user a lot of time, a lot of a heads up. So the chosen one rhetoric that All Might brings up in 257, it's nuanced. Banjo for sure, potentially the fourth were chosen in this particular regard, especially with the second and third having such a weird situation right now. I think it's worth pointing that out. Another moment that's worth pointing out is chapter 285. So the situation with chapter 285 is just the way that it was premised with Bakugo. Now in chapter 285, you had Bakugo rushing in to get Izuku. Him saying, even if One for All is a cursed power. So this was a big moment, because this was the moment that made us think like One for All is a cursed power, and that's what we also saw about like, the fourth user being scratched out. And of course, when you're in this hyper situation, it really makes it makes things feel a little bit scarier. I don't recall if at chapter 285 I wondered if maybe it depletes a user's life force. I'm pointing chapter 285 here. It's interesting. One for All is a cursed power, but what this chapter is trying to say is that it's not cursed for people like Izuku and All Might. Wow, who would have thought? So what you have here is the author used a character's lack of information to create a situation where we might have been tilted to believe that there was something negative going on. I mean, when we see that One for All is a cursed power, all of us were scared. We were scared. We were terrified for Izuku, but then it turns out, actually, no, you don't have to be scared for Izuku. It's other people. Both of these are interesting ways of using unreliable narrators. The author likes using unreliable narrator, All Might especially, and we're probably going to see more unreliable narrator. That said, what you have to look at is that the unreliable narrator, to be done correctly, the unreliable narrator is always justified. And when you look at chapter 285 and you look at chapter 257, in both situations, the narrators are completely justified. They're both acting with little information. All right, cool. Now that's the general notes. Let's move into the page-by-page walkthrough because things are going to get fun here. So page 1 is All Might having a vague awareness of what's going on in there, and also Izuku thinking about people. Now, I'm not sure if you guys noticed, but the people that Izuku is thinking about are specifically everyone that was at the final battle with him. He's not thinking about Ochako because she's irrelevant in this particular situation. Page 2 is the big note. because we got designs and we have people in timeout. Okay, so let's look at the designs real quick. So there's a couple of cool things happening with designs, little details. Hikage, he's not wearing shoes. I don't know what's going on there. Nana, interestingly, is wearing a different costume. So it's good to know that these guys can change their costumes when they're dead. Next big thing is second best genus over here. He's sitting on there in a very interesting way. He also has an interesting way of talking, saying my esteemed colleague Banjo. Yeah, no, it's really interesting how these guys look. And then we have the guys in timeout. So this is just an interesting situation. There's a Bakugo lookalike, and then when we zoom up here, we can see the gauntlets. We knew he had gauntlets on him because we saw this in the silhouette, but actually seeing it here out in the open, really interesting. The other user is the interesting one because his costume's a little bit different than I thought. I don't know. When I first saw the costume, I thought wildest theory, the wildest, craziest, I'm on a lot of drugs theory was Bakugo took Izuku's kid back in time with him, just because like his costume reminds me a little bit of Izuku's costume. But otherwise, I know that the popular theory is that this is Bakugo and Kirishima. I don't think that's Kirishima. It's interesting that this guy has to hide himself, though. Not sure who that could be. But it's interesting what's going on with the second and the third. I would hope that potentially maybe we get to see the second and third's face next chapter after Izuku leaves. I think that would be really neat. Everyone's not mentioning them, so they must know what's going on here as well. I mean, the ones that we gotta look at are the first and fourth users specifically, because they're the ones with the relationship with second and third. The second and third have a relationship with each other because of the passing. All right, page 3. Not a really big page, but I want to say something about this line. We could only interact with you by weaving through the interstices of your flickering consciousness. That's really just a fancy way of saying we could only talk to you when you were half asleep or in a similar state of mind. What a choice of words. Another thing to note here is that they only very recently were able to communicate. That's really important because it just shows to what degree these people don't know what's going on. If they knew 100% of what was going on with One For All, they would know what capabilities would be coming in the future. These guys are slaves to One For All's power development, just like the readers are. Page 5 is the mouse stuff, and we find out that All For One helped out inadvertently. Keep this factor in mind because it's, again, another unpredictable factor when it comes to One For All's growth. Also, it was really cute to see how Banjo reacted when Izuku was figuring out his words. Page 6 is Hikage's proper introduction. Page 7 is Banjo and Hikage interactions. And a lot of things to note. First, the two get along, and Banjo gets along well enough with him that Banjo serves as exposition for Hikage, which builds the idea that these two know each other relatively well. Again, reinforcing the idea that this guy was most likely chosen. I mean, again, 18 years. Anyway, you know, overall this makes sense that they would have this relationship since Hikage essentially chose Banjo. So it's cool to see actually the friendliness come out here between them. Second, Hikage using the danger sense, that was really neat. The second panel of them is just playful, but the first panel is interesting because there's no danger in someone coming to slap your shoulder, but he still is able to use danger sense. So that was really cool. Anyway, on this page we find out Hikage died of old age. Page 8, first page where we find out that the All Might vestige is capable of communication with the others. Then we find out that One For All can't be used by ordinary people. And in the My Hero Academia universe, an ordinary person is the majority, which is someone with a quirk. So really, it just means One For All cannot be used by quirky people. And I actually thought this was a really clever choice of words. It's just really neat. That really gets involved with the Hero Academia universe in a really neat way. Page 9 is a very interesting page. We find out Hikage is low-key amazing. Again, for someone who, according to All Might, wasn't chosen, he sure sacrificed a lot, and he got away from the war. He got away from the fight. Also, I realized I missed a point, but Hikage mentioned that his era was terrible. I actually like that because, you know, it would be cool if Hikage told Izuku more about what his era was like, because that's what we're going into in the current era. Anyway, on this page, we also have the thing about the cracks on his face. Very cool. The fan translation did not mention this at all. So again, another point for Viz. Anyway, keep this part in mind for later. The last third of this page is again a giant improvement over the fan translation. Actually knowing that All Might dug up autopsies is so valuable. Knowing that the autopsies are there, they probably had remarks like this guy had like the organs of an 80-year-old or like his muscle tape. Like, you know, I believe a doctor could be like, yo, this is the organ of an 80-year-old like chain smoker or something like that, right? I like that All Might was able to find that. Really great to have a resource made by people that actually know biology. And honestly, not gonna lie, if those autopsies were done by Central Hospital, I would accept them 100%. I wouldn't even bring up any question. I'm a zealot. I would be 100% on the Central Hospital side of this. Anyway, to talk about the multiple quirks thing, the idea that multiple quirks are dangerous makes sense. But you have to be really careful who you compare it to. Like, you can't compare this to All for One. All for One, the quirk probably has security systems for itself. And similarly, Monoma cannot be compared in this situation, probably because Monama's quirk has safeguards to protect him from this life-burning effect. The people you should be comparing this to are actually the people that All for One messed with, or the Nomu, because the Nomu are the only other people that can have quirks forced into them. And we know One for All is a quirk that can be forced onto other people. When you look at Nomus, we know that the standard human body can't handle more than one quirk without significant side effects. So what we have here is actually consistent with the lore about quirks being forced into bodies, the distinction being that with One for All, instead of losing your mental capabilities, you lose your life, and with the Nomu, you lose your mental capabilities instead of your life force. Page 10 is Izuku realizing the trouble, and page 11 is Izuku realizing the differences between All Might and everyone else, and this is where the trouble begins for the rest of the conversation, because it's mostly with how people are making conclusions. And then we go into page 12 and page 13. So I'm just looking at my notes here. I have 2 pages of notes for this. I don't have the energy. It's really late, so I'm not going to go through everything. I'm going to simplify things. Fundamentally, the issue with this explanation that we are getting here, the conclusions are badly made. Ultimately, the author has given himself a lot of ways out to change the rules at a later date. And the author, as you can see, he is not afraid of recontextualizing certain things. So very quickly, just to give you the overview, the parts here that give the author space to modify the information here in the future all has to do with the reliability of the information and the way that the conclusions were drawn up. First thing, the vestiges had a hypothesis as to how their existences came to be, and then when they ran into someone that didn't fit that hypothesis, they called him an exception instead of thinking that maybe their first hypothesis was incorrect. Second, the first is using All for One's personal experience to justify All Might's experience. Now, All for One is also questionable because with his knowledge base, he's deciding that he's going to pump Shigaraki full of rage juice, and that's somehow going to let him steal One for All. Third thing, this guy assumes that you can only pass a vestige on if you have a quirk factor because of what the brother says. And does that make sense? Not really. I mean, it's One for All. One for All is doing all kinds of weird things. One for All can be transferred over space. One for All somehow gets to transfer the joint strength of 8 people into the 9th person. And this is where you draw the line? At passing a copy of brainwaves at best? That's where you draw the line? That's a little bit strange. There's nothing saying that One for All is incapable of taking independently a copy of someone's brainwaves. That's within reason of the very badly defined One for All. Fourth, he brings up the nebulous factor called ownership. It truly became his own quirk. Okay, I want you to quantify that. How does something become your own quirk? What do you have to do to make it your own? Do you have to keep it for a certain period of time? Do you have to use 100% with it? See, why qualify as you make it your own when you can just say like, oh yeah, when you get it, it's officially yours and it copies you? It's a needless distinction to try and make All Might fit there, but I will give the little note here that it's probably happening because the author, he's being sensational in the same way that he wanted to take away from the other users to make All Might and Izuku more special with being chosen ones. He wants to make it seem like All Might is really the best because he made that quirk. It's only because of his efforts that All Might got to have a vestige, right? He wants to like salvage All Might for some reason. That's one reason I can think for this propaganda here. Fifth point, the thing is, they don't have enough samples to actually make good conclusions, and this takes me to the metaphor. Horikoshi wants to play around with a metaphor about a vessel. Me personally, I've seen hundreds and I've dealt in dozens. I enjoy a good metaphor. And the metaphor of the vessel is a really neat metaphor. It's really, I guess you could say, elegant in how it's produced. Now, unfortunately, this metaphor is one that has been explored throughout history. His cup spilleth over. It's a really beautiful metaphor when linked to life force. It's a really beautiful metaphor when linked to the damage a body takes. The thing is, when it comes to metaphors, is that they're very easy to break. When you apply them all the way, they can model quite a few behaviors, and that's why the cup metaphor is so good, because it can depict quite a few different ideas. If you're in a comedy, you can get away with having a half-baked metaphor. If you're in a serious story, then you better try and make sure that your metaphor doesn't break your story, or that the metaphor can't break. See, Horikoshi is saying that the problem is that you can make a cup spill over and crack it. But see, that's not the only way to make a cup spilleth. What I'm trying to convey here is just Horikoshi picked a very interesting metaphor to talk about, because Hero Academia is in a situation where the cup metaphor can actually apply in a lot of different ways. See, with the cup, there's more than one way to make its contents spill over, and there's most definitely more than one way to make the container itself crack and break. One such way, as I demonstrated, is improper use. And when you think about the context of Hero Academia, the statement improper use of one for all could kill the user. Well, that's the statement that we started Hero Academia with. Here is the particular problem. If Horikoshi wants to, he could very easily come to a situation where he changes the rules at the last minute and says something like, oh yeah, turns out Izuku can burn away his life if he uses one for all incorrectly. That wouldn't be that hard. He already has everything set up here. So this use of the metaphor, it's either incredibly stupid or incredibly intelligent. It'll be stupid if he ignores the fact that improper use can cause contents of the water to spill over. But it'll be incredibly genius if he calls up that factor of the metaphor later on. In ignoring the differences between quirkless, they ultimately ignore the question of whether or not improper use of one for all can deplete a person's life force. And honestly, when you look at Shonen Jump and their series, they love shortening the life force of their characters if it makes a situation seem harder. Like, what's to stop it? If Izuku one day needs to go plus ultra like 120% and he burns up some of his life force to do it, it's gonna work within the shonen style. It totally works, and the author has given himself the way there. Another thing, and to make it work, all the author would have to do is just slightly tweak the perception. We know that one for all, it's an energy that transfers between bodies, and we know from the anime and the way this is depicted, like Izuku gets covered in sparks. Heck, when Eri was using the power on him, we've seen it. Like, his eyes actually spark, and they spark without Eri too. There's an energy flowing through Izuku. What happens in the same way that Izuku couldn't handle 100% one for all in his arm? What's to stop the author from saying like, oh yeah, channeling 100% of one for all through an unprepared body burns away your life force? What stops him from saying that? Not that much. The only thing that stops him right now are the conclusions of the one for all vestiges. But why would I believe dead people who only recently learned how to talk to each other? They're not good sources of information. So that's my overall point here. The thing to take away here is that I would love to have this be the end of it, but unfortunately, there is a lot of space here for one of these people to be wrong, and for the author to say that this is wrong and then justify it later. Like, worst case scenario, we get to the end of it and Bakugo needs to use one for all, and then it turns out at the end that, oh yeah, one for all doesn't actually burn you if you know how to use it properly immediately, the way that All Might did. Like, for all we know, Izuku's already burnt through a good chunk of his life. I'm pretty sure Izuku's ligaments already have the condition of an 80-year-old's ligaments. One more thing, talking about how the electricity flows through Izuku's body to convey one for all, isn't it kind of interesting that the cracks that Hikage got are lightning shaped? Isn't that rather interesting? Izuku also channels one for all through his body through lightning, or like through lightning patterns. See, that's the other thing. I wish that we would have known how well these guys were at using one for all initially. But if you actually also look at the metaphor, like, there might be like one more interpretation, like just looking at the metaphor itself, is the more full your glass is, the more you have to be careful to use it correctly. Like, with an emptier glass, you have more opportunities for misuse, whereas with a fuller glass, obviously you can't you know, you can't get away with little mistakes. It's a really interesting metaphor. Maybe a little bit too much for Hero Academia's case, but still an interesting metaphor. Page 14, just a nice little irony about One for All is for people without quirks. That's okay, I thought that's what it was in the first place. Page 15 is an exaggerated reiteration of page 14. Beyond that, let's just remember, 1/5 of the population are quirkless. 20% of 7 billion is still over a billion people. Can you imagine in a time frame when a billion people are quirkless that you can say that they have all but vanished? That's still a big chunk of people. For comparison, 2% of people are redheads. So even if you assume an accelerated decline, I don't think they're going to be at 2% quirkless at Izuku's generation. They're definitely not. And I definitely do not believe that that redheads have all but vanished. Anyway, I'm pretty sure the quirkless will still have their day. It's going to take a while to actually get through that number. I think that the author's just trying to drum up Izuku being the last holder just to make the story more sensational, even if it doesn't make statistical sense. But when the first says that you're unlikely to come across another person who needs the power, yeah, I'd be willing to believe that. Page 16, the author invokes the imagery of Night Eye because he's trying to say like this was a tragedy. Oh, boo-hoo, we shouldn't have been fighting over who got this power. Oh, boo-hoo, it turned out Izuku was the perfect choice all along. Oh, boo-hoo. Anyway, it's like super heavy-handed, but again, this is really good for the story because that's the problem. We want to avoid more situations like Night Eye because the Night Eye situation shakes Izuku. Izuku doesn't have the mentality to be able to survive it. Page 17, Nana asks to kill Shigaraki. So, we all know, Izuku's going to save him. Izuku wants to save him. I'm half expecting this to be a little bit of a test, or I'm half expecting Nana to say something like, I want you to kill Shigaraki, but save Tenko, right? Because the author himself already made a distinction between Tenko and Shigaraki. So, that's what we got there with Nana. Looks like next week we're going to have another round of this. Hopefully, it'll be a more interesting conversation. I am hoping that we get more stuff next week. I'm hoping that Izuku leaves. And I'm hoping that when he leaves, we'll get to see the second and third user talk to the other users. Maybe they'll talk about, hey guys, why do you put yourselves in timeout? I think that'd be very interesting. Other thing, it seems like everyone's going to wake up at around the same time because the people here, they're talking about Izuku at the very beginning. And they were saying like, hey man, we got to talk to you before you wake up. So that seems like Izuku's waking period is coming really quickly. I don't think we're going to get a big time skip at that point. Anyway, that was chapter 304 of Hero Academia. What a wonderful chapter. Guys, let me know what you thought down below. That's it for me. Thank you very much. Until next time, I hope you have a great day. And for anyone wondering if I spilled water myself, yes, but it's just water. Yeah, it's just water. I'm good. Anyway, everyone, thank you so much. And until next time, I hope you have an absolutely great day.